Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Poser. I'm the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Library, and I'm more than happy to invite you to today's seminar. That I am going to turn it over to Rebecca Funk, who's the Citizen Science Program Support Specialist, to introduce today's seminar.
Hello. I want to thank you all again for taking the time to join us as we continue in our series discussing important topics and issues within citizen science. Very excited about this month's session. I think it's going to tie in really nicely with some of the previous talks that we've had. We're very fortunate to be joined by Jules Vastine. Jules is the director for the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring, ALLARM, at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They are responsible for the leadership of ALLARM and providing technical assistance to watershed communities interested in using citizen science as a tool for change. Jules has worked in the volunteer monitoring citizen science field for 22 years. They are also a native of the Chesapeake Bay region, and they enjoy working with community organizations to build their capacity to monitor, protect, and restore water quality in Pennsylvania and New York. In addition to their love with communities on streaming monitoring, Jules also enjoys hiking, biking, cooking, and yoga. And with that, we'll be turning it over for their session today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you, NOAA, for inviting me to be a part of your citizen science series. I really enjoyed a conversation with Rebecca and John McLaughlin a couple of months ago, and we had started talking about the role of quality assurance project plans and where that shows up in the space of citizen participatory science. And as we were chatting, we were like, wait, can we expand the topic from quality assurance project plans to, what are some tips and tricks for enhancing credibility in your community science project? And so I was really excited that we were able to expand the scope of today's conversation. So there's a couple of things that I want to cover today. So first, I do want to introduce you all to the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring, or ALLARM, and also just touch really lightly on some models, primarily to make a point. So we'll get through those quickly. And then we're going to get into data credibility. There's so much information I want to pack into that. So hopefully everything flows smoothly throughout our presentation. And then as we close, I'm going to specifically hone in on the role of technical support providers and why that's a crucial ingredient as we're thinking about credibility in our citizen science, participatory science projects. And I'm hoping that we'll have a good 15-20 minutes for Q&A. So let's go ahead and hop in. So NOAA colleagues, I just would like to highlight that I'm a water quality monitoring person. That might be evident by our name, Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring. And we are a community science center at Dickinson College, which is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And we were founded in 1986. And our central mission, all we've done for 38 years, is supporting communities in conducting water quality assessments and using those data for local change. Of a little bit more about us as an organization, we're a combination of professional staff and also student staff being based at an academic institution. We're a co-curricular program, so we're providing opportunities for students to apply what they're learning in the classroom to benefit the communities we work with in Pennsylvania and New York. And just because it's always nice to highlight, we are not fully supported by the college. We're 30% supported by the college and 70% supported by federal, state, and family foundation grants. So so folks who have heard of us before and or have been in the room with us in presentations, you've seen this map. So it's a good one. It's a good way of describing ALLARM's work in one image. And one of the reasons why I like to highlight this is, one, to show where we are in the region. So the primary outline there is the state of Pennsylvania, and then we have some offshoots into New York, and then a little teeny tiny offshoot into West Virginia. But over the course of ALLARM's 38 years working with volunteer and community scientists, we've used 3 different operational models to engage folks in water quality data collection. Our first model was a top-down model. You could say it was a contributory model where we worked with volunteers to collect pH and alkalinity data to help document the extent of the impact of acid rain on Pennsylvania's waterways. We received the most acidic rainfall in any state in the nation. And then when you look at the green, you'll notice that those are shapes of both sub-watersheds and then also counties. The green on the map represents partnerships where ALLARM has used the co-created model, where we walk in step with community partners at every step and stage in the scientific process, from program development to data use and application. And then the yellow on the map represents one of two collaboratory projects. The yellow represents where we did shale gas monitoring trainings. That was for 10 years in between 2010 and 2020. And then we also have another collaborative program, Stream Team, which is helping to fill spatial and temporal gaps in Chesapeake Bay tributaries in Pennsylvania and New York. So one of the things, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about terminology. The one thing I wanted to, there's two things I want to highlight. One, there are so many different names to describe members of the public being engaged in scientific data collection. And one of the things that I think is really important to highlight, especially in spaces where we are talking about data credibility in this type of work, is highlighting the fact that all of the terms that are used to describe public participation in data collection notes the body of people collecting the data rather than the scientific technique that is being used. So right out of the gates, I just want to call out that this is the only form of science that is denoted by the participants collecting the data rather than the scientific field supporting the technique. That out of the gates inserts bias and leads to perceptions about these data. So I always like to point that out, that it does, I think, underserve the community by naming it this way. And we should just call it science, but that could be a conversation for the end. I won't talk about this too much, but I did just describe 3 of 5 models that are highlighted in the Shirk-Wilderman 2012 Ecology and Society paper, which was one of the first papers to really talk about different models of engagement for participatory science. And really what I want to highlight with this is, regardless of the role that the public plays in the different steps of the scientific process, it is absolutely important that credibility and techniques to enhance the confidence in the data being collected and generated and used is always considered at the outset of the project. So let's get into those ingredients. So this is a slide that covers some of those successful components of participatory science projects. So I'm so glad that I'm following on the heels of Rebecca Funk's webinar last month, which really looked at how do you set up a project for success. We're a huge proponent of what is called study design, where you're walking through the who, what, where, what's, and whys of your monitoring program. There is a role for quality assurance project plans. We'll get to that in a little bit. And then there's lots of different other tools and resources that are brought into programs to help verify that data, that you're collecting credible data and you're getting the best data with the equipment that you have. Other components of a successful program is absolutely thinking through your volunteer engagement strategy. Some folks might be a little surprised to hear that in a data credibility webinar, but thinking through how you're going to recruit, retain, and celebrate your volunteers is really important, because you're also going to be scaffolding in the skill building throughout their experience. So being able to anticipate the life cycle of a volunteer in your program, anticipating their needs and their points of contact, inevitably the more volunteers feel connected to the work that they are doing, the greater attention they give to the work that they are implementing. So it's always important to think through that. And certainly we cannot talk about successful programs without talking about the role of evaluation and assessment. One, to make sure that you're, following through on the goals of your program, but making sure that you're making iterative improvements as you're going along. Okay, so let's get into those successful points of building credibility. So first and foremost, planning is your number one credibility tool. It is really important to think through the different approaches and goals and values and as you're setting up your program. As I mentioned before, and I'll drop in the chat later on a link to ALLARM study design manual. But this is a process where first you take stock. How does monitoring fit in with your organizational goals? Do you have the resources and budget to be able to do this and do it well? Then you move into defining the scope, helping folks to identify the question that is driving data collection is very important at the outset, because that helps to start frame for volunteer scientists why they are collecting data. How will these data connect to answering the questions that they want to, what ultimately lends itself to them using the data? And that's another crucial question, and we'll get to that later on, of thinking through your data use goals, because then essentially you have to think about aligning the quality of the techniques and the credibility of the techniques with your data use goals. Then you get into the monitoring specifics, the who, what, where, why, hows of data collection. You think through your data management systems, from data sheets to data sharing. You think through your quality control measures, internal and external measures, and then thinking through the tasks and who will do them. So in the study design process, ALLARM commonly uses a co-created approach to this. So what I have here is those 10 questions that guide us through the study design process. And the questions that are highlighted 1, 2, and 3 are highlighted in yellow. And these are questions that the community in a co-created model has to define for themselves. Thinking through all their goals and objectives with facilitation from a service provider. The blue boxes, which are number 4, 5, and 8, this is really where technical support service provider is going to be really important. Because oftentimes people who are volunteering their time to collect data, they don't know what are the right techniques and the right parameters for the questions that they're asking. And that's a great role for a technical support provider to take that guesswork out of the process. And then questions 6, 7, 9, and 10 are in green because these are questions that both the service provider and the community are collaboratively walking through. So lots of different roles as you're developing that comprehensive data plan. This is an image that I pulled from the Environmental Protection Agency's National Advisory Council for Environmental Policy and Technology report that came out in 2016. And they have this spectrum of data use. And when you're developing, your data collection program, it is important to identify who are your primary and secondary data users, and what are your primary and secondary data use goals? Because that will inevitably identify the equipment sensitivity that you'll need to help answer those questions or meet those data use goals. And I like that this is a spectrum, because oftentimes projects can start off with a single, like an ideal goal, but you never know how secondary users of data are going to use it, and they often use it beyond the original scope of a monitoring program. So making sure that your program is set up for data sharing and the necessary metadata helps increase diverse uses. I'm pulling a slide here. ALLARM is very privileged to be a part of the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, which is an EPA-funded project to integrate data collected by non-agency data collectors throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And there's a couple of things that we were required to do in our first grant from EPA. And one of that was to develop what was called a tiered framework. And that's where you're, kind of like that data use spectrum, thinking through different data uses and starting to identify the techniques that match up with those data uses. And one of the things that we've borrowed from River Network, is originally developed by a man named Jeff Dates, rest in power, is the spectrum where you're looking at moving from educational goals to regulatory assessment, policy management. You'll notice as you're moving through those tiers, and you are required to have equipment with more refined sensitivity and things like that, it's going to increase the time, rigor, and expense of those programs and projects. when you're a service provider, there's a lot of back pocket tricks and tips that are really important to help, set up programs. And I'm realizing that this graphic is coming up really small here. This is pulled directly out of ALLARM study design manual. But one of the things that we did as a service provider is we thought through the common water quality concerns and questions. This is specifically for the state of Pennsylvania that volunteers tend to be interested in, from point source to stormwater to agricultural runoff to acid mine drainage. And we went through and thought about what are the techniques that are accessible, both in price and in techniques for volunteers. And we came up with a list of parameters that match in with those different questions that people might ask here in Pennsylvania. So what we have is we have a stream indicator, so biological, visual, and then chemical. Some of that's a little physical too. Then you have your monitoring techniques, so that gets at what's being evaluated. Then you have a little blurb on the importance of it, and that talks about what that parameter can do in terms of its assessment. And then we have the check boxes of what water quality in pollution indicator it can help answer. And then the last column, which is probably a little difficult to read, is difficulty, so that folks have a sense of the accessibility of the different techniques as they're setting up their program. But regardless of the type of data collection that's happening in your project, there's opportunities to increase data credibility in lots of diverse ways. So in this slide here, one in the top left corner, this is a visual assessment that is happening. That's a qualitative tool, but there are ways that you can QC this. You can have people take pictures and grab samples and things like that to verify that even in a qualitative assessment, you can verify that volunteers are collecting data correctly. The next slide at the top right corner, these are folks learning how to use chemical monitoring kits. So from rinsing your glassware to acid washing your dishes when you're done, there's so many things that you can build in for that. The lower left-hand corner, these are folks collecting water bugs or benthic macroinvertebrates, and there's lots of great fun QC things that you can build into that. Pictures being a good one, and also preserving samples and having a secondary identifier or having a trained identifier on site to help review that. And then this last picture on the lower right are folks debating the findings in their data. So even as folks are finding the stories in their data, there is a place for you to be able to insert tips and tricks for data credibility. And then the last thing I'll mention before moving into our next slides is, again, some of these back pocket tips and tricks that are important to have. And I'll talk a little bit more about the role of equipment testing later on, but not all cost-effective equipment out there is created equal. So let's think about rain gauges. Let's think about temperature gauges. You want to get the best equipment for your price point. And so if you're an organization that is a service provider and you have the ability to test equipment, again, we want to help volunteers and communities take the guesswork out of the decision-making process. Having tools like this and the ability to continually test techniques and identify what are the best ones for the price point is really, really important, because oftentimes folks will have shoestring budgets to work with, and we want to make sure we're getting the best data possible with the resources that they have. Okay, so now we're coming into my favorite part of the presentation, and that's, getting into our data collection reminders and thinking through the role of co-ops and how you translate decisions made in a co-op into our practices. But I wanted to leave you with three things before we or at least get you pondering about three things before we move into that. First and foremost, all data of documented quality have use. And what I mean by that is, any data that has the right metadata helps data users of all kinds make decisions about how they want to consider and evaluate and use these data. But metadata is absolutely important so that you are generating data of documented quality. The other thing is you have to match the intended use with the quality of data collected. So that's often a really tricky conversation to have during the study design phase, where you're having to set boundaries and set expectations around the resources a community might have, and identify, what is capable with the resources they have. So, for example, you got to know, like metals, for example, that's a common issue related with acid mine drainage. There are no volunteer accessible techniques for metals. That is something where a group would have to invest in, lab certified techniques to be able to get that. It's important to know that going in that. But anyway, we want to match the intended use with the quality of data collected. And last but certainly not least, I want everyone to hold on to the fact that volunteer scientists want to collect data. They are giving us their most precious commodity, which is their free time. Nobody wants to waste their free time. So let's all hold that in our hearts and remember that volunteers contributing to data collection want to make an impact in their community. They want to help answer environmental questions, and they want to help contribute to meaningful scientific research. And that is talked about consistently throughout the literature as the 3 top motivations for volunteer scientists. Okay, so let's talk about what are data of documented quality. So if I have any quality assurance managers or folks that review QAPs on, I hope you all are like, woo, we're pulling stuff out of the EPA Quality Assurance Handbook here. But what we mean by data of documented quality is making sure that data are reproducible. Reproducible meaning that if a same sample is being analyzed, that you're able to reproduce the results with the technique that you have. Representative, is it representative of the true value that you are assessing? Is it comparable? Is it comparable to other techniques and data points? And are they complete? And complete gets at that point about metadata. It's not the value that's being recorded, but you need the value and your units of measurements, and you need your locations, and you need your techniques, all those types of things. We want to have reproducible, representative, comparable, and complete data. That's what we mean by data of documented quality. Now, there's lots of variations of the similar definitions out there of what is quality assurance, quality control, and quality assurance project plans. Quality assurance refers to the larger plan for maintaining quality in all aspects of the program. Quality control gets at those specific technical activities or actions that are taken to measure quality or limit error in the generation of data. And then the quality assurance project plan is a formal written document that lays out all the detailed quality control procedures that are used to achieve specific projects' data quality requirements. And I can drop the citations for that later as well. So one of the things that came out from EPA, I think it was 2020, is they updated. So EPA had a volunteer monitoring guide to developing quality assurance project plans. But it was more specific to the water monitoring community. And after the Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing Act was passed, EPA devoted resources into developing comprehensive approaches and guidance for building data credibility into your programs, regardless of the media that's being evaluated. So they have 3 tools. One is the handbook. So the handbook is something that you could read from start to finish, or you can look at different chapters and sections to help hone in on specific topics. But one of the things that you'll notice with the handbook is it regularly cites the templates document as well as the examples. So the templates literally, they're blank pages with different prompts and questions and categories of things for you to think through as you're developing your quality assurance project plan. And then they also have a document with example quality assurance project plans. But the one thing I'm going to say to everyone is, if you've ever had to write a QAP, I see you and I feel you. But please share it with others. Being able to help others get through their first QAPs, everyone knows what it's like to get through your very first quality assurance project plan. Being able to share those with others is really, really important. The other thing that I'll put out there that I think is important to highlight is the role of things like umbrella QOPs and or QOP templates. So in the Chesapeake, through the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, we've created 3 what we refer to as umbrella QOPs, 1 for macroinvertebrates, 1 for tidal monitoring, and 1 for non-tidal monitoring. And what we did is we surveyed the common techniques that are used for water quality monitoring by non-agency entities, and we developed quality assurance project plans that cover the most common techniques. Now, an umbrella QOP and QOPs in general can exist in a vacuum. The way that umbrella QOPs work out very well in the Chesapeake is it is connected to the role of a service provider to be sitting down with groups and making sure that as they're developing or refining their programs, that they are making choices that are in alignment with the laid out or suggested quality assurance, quality control measures. So that's an umbrella QOP. So it does cover a large geography and a lot of common techniques in that geography. A QOP template. So what I have on the screen here is EPA's sanitary survey app for marine and freshwaters. And their QOP template, like they've done all the writing for you. And then they've even gone through and they've highlighted in yellow the different sections that you have to tailor and adjust to your own program. So, if there are common programs, like for example, assessing for cyanobacteria, like that's a great place for thinking about a QOP template. If folks are using comparable techniques and it requires some tailoring to the location and approach, you can use a QOP template and have those highlighted sections where folks put in the pertinent information that's specific to their program. Love me a good umbrella QOP and QOP template. Okay, but I just have to say, QOPs often are used as a tool to prevent access to data use in some locations. So oftentimes I'm in spaces where people are like, well, does that group have a QOP? If not, we're not going to use their data. And I just would like to highlight, and this is part of a really fun conversation that John and Rebecca and I had a couple of months ago, is like there isn't a systematic approach to reviewing QOPs, and not all agencies have the time and the availability to review QOPs. So requiring that people have a federally approved quality assurance project plan can be a barrier to helping those data be used. And the thing that I want to highlight is for those of us who run programs or those of us who are service providers and are facilitating data collection processes, we should be maintaining our own quality assurance project plans regardless of whether or not they are federally approved. Because one of the things that those documents do is it really helps you answer all the different types of questions and helps you consider the decisions that need to be made to maintain quality in your programs. So we should have those. But when it comes to our community volunteers and our volunteer scientists, it is our role as a service provider or a project implementer to then translate those decisions into volunteer accessible tools. So, for example, does your program have a monitoring methods manual? Every time ALLARM works with a new community partner in a co-created design, we develop for them their own unique monitoring methods manual that already incorporates all of those quality, control decisions, quality assurance decisions into it. And I'll talk about how that gets translated in a little minute. Training workshops are super important. Training, education, making sure you're building people's skills to be able to do these techniques confidently. That's a part of your quality assurance project plan, but that's a tool that it becomes accessible for the volunteers. Thinking through different educational materials and even thinking through like data collection. I'll show our data sheet in a little minute and you'll see how we reinforce the data credibility decisions through all these different tools. Okay, so let's talk about some resources. So the Stream Team Monitoring Methods Manual, that's the box over there on the left. So this is the cookbook for volunteers to follow every time they go out and do data collection. And that's a huge component of our training, is to emphasize that people do not do things by memory, but they're always referencing their monitoring methods manual to ensure that they're following the practices in the exact same ways. Remember, we want to make that reproducible data that we had talked about with what we mean by data of documented quality. So, having that laid out with all your tips and tricks of how many times you're rinsing your glassware and things like that is really important. So even in the training phase, we won't even, our students and our staff, we don't read the directions. We have the volunteers read the directions, guiding everyone through the steps in the data collection process. And the other thing that we do is we have a video library to help reinforce the training materials in the monitoring methods manual. So I have a screen grab from our acid washing tutorial. And yes, our volunteers, every time they do a technique, we as the service provider are thinking it through and looking up the technique in standard methods, literally the book of chemical standard methods, and making sure that the processes that they're doing are aligning with standard methods so that they're getting the best data possible with the equipment they have. And since nutrients is a common thing that folks are concerned with in water quality, acid washing is going to be a part of your data collection process. Other resources that we have, again, so for us, after we do our first training, we then go through, they go through a quality control check, which I'll talk about later on. But then a month after people start monitoring, we'll have a meeting to talk about data reminders. So this is a guide here that we have that looks at how to do things like, when you're doing replicates, what's the appropriate range, plus or minus for replicates? How do you round? It has those decisions. Having things like holding times reinforced for the samples, reminding people they have to refrigerate their samples if they're not testing them right away for nutrients and other parameters are really important. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight, because again, all tools support the data credibility decisions in your program, is I wanted to show our data sheet. So first and foremost, this box up here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you see this, my mouse, this box up here has the start time of when people start doing data collection. And then this bottom yellow box is the end time. Just a note for all of us that we document how many hours our volunteers contribute to data collection, from calibrating their equipment to acid washing their glassware, or whatever the calibration of your equipment to cleaning up afterwards and data entry. Be sure it's all included. But anyway, on our data sheet, this top box here is, has the equipment been gathered? Has it been inspected? Is it ready to use? And then we have some checks in there. Check here if you have calibrated your meter to this standard and if you've calibrated your meter to this standard. The other thing that we have in our data sheet is for nitrate nitrogen, it's important that you test that sample at room temperature. So they have to go from a chilled environment to a room temperature environment, and those degrees centigrade are stipulated in the monitoring methods manual. So it asks people, did you test at room temperature, and did you verify that with your thermometer? And then the other thing that we do is we have our replicates here, and then we have the plus or minus allowed for your replicate range. So again, it's important that all your tools reinforce each other, and then this helps, so people aren't flipping back and forth. It's right there on their data sheet, which makes it accessible. And then the other thing to think about is, how do you confirm that volunteers are using their equipment correctly and or following prescribed protocols in the way that they're laid out? So first and foremost, replicates are your best friend. That's an example of an internal quality control measure. I'm not sure why I put that in quotation marks. It is an internal quality control measure. Another thing that you can do is you can do side-by-side sampling, where a volunteer is sampling and you have your trainer or your service provider organization watching them and seeing and making sure they're following the techniques appropriately. Something that we do, and we run a quality assurance lab for the state of Pennsylvania. So anyone who wants to go through a duplicate sample process with us, they can. And what we do with that is a volunteer will collect a sample, and they'll collect a second sample as they're out in the field. They'll test one sample using their techniques, and then they'll send us the sample, and we'll test that sample using their techniques as well as equipment with refined sensitivity. So it actually gives them two chances to pass their quality control test. And if they don't pass, we retrain them and give them tips and tricks. Most of the time we can anticipate what went wrong And if they keep failing on a particular parameter, we'll just drop that out of the list of things that they collect. Not everyone has access to running a quality control lab. So there's things that you can do like quizzes to help verify that folks are actually following their procedures correctly. And then for those of you that are working with a certified lab for your cyanos analysis, making sure your chain of custody form's in place and that your sample bottles have been documented at appropriate cleaning and all that kind of stuff is really important. Okay, so I'm looking at the time and I want to wrap up with these next few slides and just highlight that, the role of technical support providers is really important. So that's something to think about if you are considering developing a new participatory science project, is thinking through the role of technical support. So one, we're here to be able to see the big picture. At ALLARM, this is our full-time job, is to support these kinds of projects. And so we're constantly moving from that micro to macro level to make sure that folks are, seeing that big picture and we're maintaining all those decisions and the different elements of the programs. The other thing that we can do is we can ensure that as programs are being set up, that the data quality meets the data use goals. And we can help set those expectations from the beginning around, what needs to happen in monitoring programs or data collection to do that. Eliminating the guesswork. Again, I just think I have the best job in the world. I get to work with people who are volunteering their time to contribute to data collection and putting these data to use in their local communities. It is incredible, to be able to do that. And I love being able to take the guesswork out of it. I don't want a volunteer to be spinning their wheels or getting frustrated trying to find the answers when we can help provide them. And that's a really great role for a service provider. Helping volunteer scientists feel seen and heard. A lot of times, out in the field, people will run into some challenges and things like that, and being able to help people troubleshoot things, or, as folks are dealing with life and thinking around workarounds to help people stay engaged, even when, their intersectional identities get too busy, or maybe someone has a health concern and they still want to be involved, but they can't do the field work. Making sure they feel seen and heard and supported is really important. And also, I just like to say, I think we make the process fun. Folks are volunteering their time. You want to make this fun. I tell you, if we can get people laughing, even while doing acid washing, that's a good training. Putting that out there. And I'm really thankful that in our space at ALLARM, we get to be a part of 2 service provider networks. So in Pennsylvania, we have the oldest non-agency service provider network. That's the Consortium for Scientific Assistance to Watersheds. We are funded by the state to provide technical support to communities to do water quality data collection, founded in 2001. And then, as I've already mentioned, the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, lots of cool things we've been able to do throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. And just, as we're coming into the Q&A, and I hope folks have some questions, always just like to end with a photo of our volunteers and just thinking about the incredible work that they do. And every volunteer is a story and an experience. I'll never forget when Ruby Dora, she came to a macrovertebrate workshop being like, I don't want to touch the bugs. I don't want to be engaged with the bugs. And then she became our expert volunteer identifier. Jeff Klein here is our best DIY inventor. He has 2 master's degrees, including one in engineering, and he's always helping us develop fun, accessible techniques. Latisse Brown is the stormwater coordinator for the city of York in Pennsylvania, and is always finding fun, innovative ways of using the data that she's collecting in her volunteer time and putting that to use. So just absolutely appreciate the folks that we get to work with, and excited to see what questions we have in the Q&A.
Okay.
I'm good with slides. So I guess if folks want to contact me, I guess they could look at that, but we can put that in the documents afterwards.
We can indeed. Thank you so much, Jules, and welcome back on screen, Rebecca. We do have one question to kick it off. I think the brave person who put this in as the first question, so I'm going to show it on the screen here. Um, Thank you for highlighting how consideration of participant engagement can lead to increased data quality. Do you think integrating intentional education experiences can likewise lead to increased data quality?
Ooh, yeah. Oh, that's a great question, John. Thank you for putting that in there. So one of the things that I found, and I hear this a lot from folks that run programs, is thinking through a scaffolded engagement strategy and educational strategy for your volunteers. So, for example, like we run a regional data collection program. It is called Stream Team. And also, it's not a unique name. Missouri is the first state to have a stream team, and I've been able to find at least 12 other stream teams out there. So just acknowledging that maybe we could benefit from some creativity. But with Stream Team, like we have a whole 2-year rollout and identification of the skills we're going to build at different times, and making sure that there's opportunities for further engagement. And so, like, we start with our monthly monitoring workshop. Then they have to go through a quality control test. Then they go through a follow-up meeting. 6 months later, we have an in-person follow-up meeting, always with food, always feed your volunteers. And we do another quality control check. Then they learn how to enter data into the database. Then at some point, depending on weather and considerations, you teach about macroinvertebrate identification. And then a stipulated amount of time after that, you teach people how to discover the story in their data. The other thing with that program that's been super cool is we had volunteers say, hey, we have some ideas for parameters that we think could help enhance the data collection. And so halfway through Stream Team's existence, we revisited our study design, and we added in 2 additional parameters. So we're always thinking of ways to like build out additional training tools and experiences. And then the other thing that we do with Stream Team is, even though they're organized by a specific geography for their smaller community, we do connect them to the larger group. And we always have really diverse discussion topics on that. So like we've developed some guides as a result of those conversations, from like winter monitoring guidelines. We identified a salt pulse after a huge winter storm event. I mean, it's just like you always want to think through like those touch points to help build that. But yeah, if I had additional tools and tips to train people on, I would keep doing that to keep them engaged beyond, the 5-year point.
Thanks, Jules. We have one more question that came in. You talked about anticipating secondary uses. What about considering inappropriate secondary uses, i.e., using the data to make inferences that the data can't really support?
I did a year at a detail with the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was my first time hearing that as a really strong concern, that like data being misused to tell erroneous stories and things like that. And honestly, I hadn't thought about it as a concern because we have just been trying to amplify how amazing the data are that our volunteers are collecting, and we want them to be used. And so I hadn't thought about like the downsides of different folks cherry picking data. I think that's, something that you have to come to terms with. I think when you're using publicly accessible databases and where folks can download data and use them in diverse ways, I think my biggest recommendation for helping to assuage that concern is get your publications out, get your data report cards out, analyzing the data with the scientific integrity that you want your program to be maintaining. And I think all of us, I primarily was talking about data credibility from a data collection standpoint. We could have a whole nother conversation talking about data credibility related to data management. And, one of the things that we spend time on when we're teaching volunteers to analyze and interpret their own data is, what do you do with outliers? Because sometimes there's that bias to throw out an outlier, but sometimes you need to like check that and make sure that, was this a pollution event, or is it a data entry error? Like, what is it, right? So I think we just need to make sure that we're constantly analyzing our data with integrity, as a way to combat other narratives. But at the end of the day, I haven't seen that a lot, at least in the work. Fortunately, I have not seen that a lot in the work that I've done. And I did I ran a fracking monitoring program. So I think let's not let that be the hurdle, and let's promote getting those data reports and data uses and data communication tools out as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Jules. That was great. I am not seeing another pending question yet. So I'll just remind the audience that the Q&A is available, and we'll give you, 30 seconds to put your questions in. And while we wait for that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to talk about the citizen science series here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As we mentioned before, we're trying to keep this series going throughout the year. So every month we're going to be featuring different topics and speakers like Jules. All of these videos are recorded and they are available on the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel after the event. So if you missed it, or if you'd like to be able to share this information with other members throughout your community, do check them out on YouTube. All of our resources are on there. We're going to keep this going in June. I'm very excited. Our next speaker will be Dr. Monica Ramirez of Arizona. They're going to be presenting on inclusion and diversity in your citizen science participants for different projects. They've been working with different nonprofit organizations, and they've also received some grant funding. And we're really excited to read up on to learn more about the initiatives that they're doing, especially in agricultural communities in Arizona.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Oh, I'm so glad Monica is going to be presenting in this. That's so great.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that. We did have one extra question show up, so I'm going to put that in there. Can you speak to the trade-off between a program that is one-size-fits-all program versus a tiered engagement skill level? Pros, cons on that.
Ooh. Oh, that's a good question. And I'm not sure I'm necessarily the best person to answer that, because we do tend to operate using the co-created and collaborative models. But I will say some of the limitations of having that model of, like, I mean, we know all our volunteers, right? Like, we know their names, we know their stories, we know their dogs if they bring them to the meetings, It means that when you're doing that level of intensive resources, we will hit our capacity of how many communities we're able to service and or how many volunteers we can engage. We are a staff of 4 full-time people, 2 part-time people, and students. And so sometimes that also places limits on the geography that you can reach. So I think about some of the coolest, not coolest, but some of the larger data, citizen science data collection programs. You look at like Cornell's eBird program. I mean, their database has billions of data points. And that is, folks submitting the data as they collect it. These are folks that do birding for a passion or learning to bird. I've, submitted data myself, and I'm an amateur birder. And like, wow, the amount of data that they can analyze and answer diverse questions is super cool. So I think like each program has its benefits, and each type of model and program has its challenges. And I think like if you're an entity that's looking to launch a program, you do have to make those decisions as to, what your goals are for, your goals are from data collection, the questions you want to answer, and what you want the volunteer experience to be. It just depends, I think, on what your goal is, and then make sure you design your program in a way that meets those goals. So there's pros and cons to every model out there. So, yeah. Great question.
It was. And we do have a follow-up of what is the ballpark retention rate of volunteers from when they start to 2 years or so later?
So again, now this, if we have any social scientists on the call, please join the chat. So it's really interesting. So ALLARM has been around for 38 years, and we've run a variety of different types of monitoring programs. And one of our oldest partners that we work with right now is the Ridge and Valley Stream Keepers. And we have folks collecting data in that program for 15 plus years. Literally, we're losing volunteers as they move or as they pass. I mean, like, these are folks who are just like, they have integrated data collection as a part of their goals, values, and the way they live their lives, right? And so it was really interesting to me when ALLARM launched our fracking monitoring program. It was our first time doing a pollution reporting protocol. We could not retain volunteers. We conducted over 80 trainings. We trained close to 4,000 people, and we could not get people to stick around in that project. And I was really fortunate that ALLARM was a part of a National Science Foundation project run by Kat Davis at University of Maryland. And the questions they were asking was looking at, how people learn throughout the data collection process. But one of the cool things is a whole bunch of us started swapping stories on like volunteer motivation and retention. And we were paired with all these amazing social scientists. And it was the first time that I was introduced to different theories of motivation. And then we took one and then we applied it to our shale gas program to test and see why people were not sticking in the program. They got the same level of training. They even got more attention from us. All the tricks and tips for retaining volunteers, we were doing it and then some, and we still weren't retaining people. And what it came down to was a balance between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation factors. So with our volunteers, like the Ridge and Valley Stream Keepers, like they're looking to collect data because they have this beautiful watershed and they want to like show the world the quality of this watershed. For anglers that decide to like add data collection into, the process of going to their favorite fishing hole. That is an example of an intrinsic motivation factor where you are drawn from within to do something. You tend to be able to last longer in doing that. Extrinsic motivation factors is when you feel compelled by external forces to do something. And shale gas extraction is a contentious topic. And at the time in which we rolled out our protocol, we were lacking state standards for it. There were so many mixed messages in the media. People referred to fracking as one part of the project process. The community referred to it as the whole process. It was just like a really challenging issue. And people felt like they had to do data collection and show up to these workshops because they didn't think anyone would listen to them, or they didn't know what to believe, and they felt compelled because this was this big issue, and people burned out a lot faster. So I do think that that's important to consider as you're developing your programs, to think about whether or not you're drawing on intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. And then the ballpark retention, to get people past the 2-year point, it is really important to have people feel seen and heard. And I'm pretty sure I saw one of ALLARM's former community science specialists, Stephanie Letourneau, and we have Phoebe Galleon on as well. They can talk to you about the number of conversations that they have with volunteers, the number of emails you get, phone calls, setting up your Zoom calls. It was really challenging for us to keep people engaged through COVID because we actually told people to stop monitoring for 6 months because we didn't know what was safe and what was not. And then we had to increase our online engagement. So I think when people feel like they are connected to a project and they're feeling seen and heard, and they feel connected to a larger community, that really helps people stay involved. And when they know that they're collecting their data credibly and doing it with confidence. When people pass QC, we usually have them, but when people don't pass QC, they often don't stay a part of the program past the 2-year point. So that's one of the reasons why, as we're talking about, building data credibility into your program, you have to think through your volunteer engagement plan so that you can think through all those diverse ways in which you're going to show up for them, especially if you're using a co-created model. Ooh, I just saw the data sovereignty question.
Yes. So our next question is, hi, Jules. Thanks for your talk. Can you speak a bit on the importance of data sovereignty to those who collect data for citizen science projects?
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. So, gotta shout out Dr. Karen Cooper at NC State, North Carolina State University, and shout out their data ethics toolkit funded by the National Science Foundation. You can also find that off of the Association for the Advancement of Participatory Science. So, data ownership is really important. And I think I'm not going to be able to do injustice in the time that we have left to talk about data ethics and considerations. And one of the things I absolutely love about the way that the field is talking and engaging this topic, and Monica can speak to this next month, she has published papers with all of her volunteers listed as co-authors, making sure you're acknowledging that. One of the things that we really emphasize with the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, because we do maintain a regional database, is these are our volunteers' data. They're not ALLARM's data. They're the volunteers' data. They're the ones that are donating their time and collecting these data. And they get to have their credit in the way that they want to. So when the data are downloaded, they have that option of being able to say if they want their name attached to them. And it is so important to have data feedback loops in place so that if you're using a volunteer's data, they know how. So making sure that, they're being uplifted in the publications and things like that is really important. Oh my gosh, we're really getting all these questions. We got 3 minutes left.
We do have 3 minutes. So I'll show this next one real quick. For retention and engagement, going back to that volunteer question, would surveying volunteers when they first join be most helpful or progressively
Oh
little checkpoints built
yeah.
in?
Okay, so I'm just going to say down the road, not to keep dominating your citizen science series, I do have a volunteer retention training I do. Absolutely, you want to keep the surveys up. We do a whole orientation to the program. We do an information session so people know what they're getting into and they can ask all their questions. Iterative surveys are really important, and being open to that feedback and showing folks that you're listening to their feedback, super important. So yes, please use all forms of data collection to help with retention.
Thank you so much, Jules. We did have a related digression that WMO's data quality management system incorporates some of those ideas into their system, and that it is important to inform providers of data what is being done with the data they provide.
Snaps. Yeah, it was so funny. I don't know if any of my SAM's Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative colleagues are on here, but we're doing updates to our data, the Chesapeake Data Explorer. Baby, can you drop it in the chat? And one of the things that we were talking about is what kind of requirements do we have in place when people download the data so that we can help support responsible data use, feedback loops, and reinforcing those ethics that are called out by the citizen science toolkit for data ethics. And including asking people to say how they intend to use the data, letting us know who they are and things like that so that we can follow up with them. So anyway, if they're not on this call, I'm going to share this part of the conversation because it is really I'm so glad people are talking about this and building these options into their data management systems. Got to respect the effort and work that goes into generating these data by our volunteer scientists.
Thank you so much, Jules. Okay, we are right at time, so I'm going to stop us here. I just want to thank everyone for your awesome questions, for your great conversation happening in the chat. I want to thank Jules. I want to thank Rebecca. And remind everybody again of that June 20th. Keep your eyes open. We will be having the next Citizen Science Program seminar on June 20th. So, everyone, thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again, Jules.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day, everyone.